Oh, I see people are starting to enter the room. All right, well, we'll give it a few minutes as I see people are starting to pop in here. So welcome everybody who is just showing up and joining us for this webinar. You can see on the right here, we have a chat box. And I've asked folks if you want to just say hi. We've got about 70 people on the call today. So it'd be nice if you're here to go ahead and type your name in and say hello to all the people that you've traveled with. And we will get underway in just a second. So I just see attendee numbers just kind of clicking up here. All right, well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this gathering today. I'm Kristina Nemeth, the Director of Travel at the Club. I know most of you from taking our civil rights trip in the last 2 years. And I hope you are all doing well. I am definitely missing travel and missing all of you. However, I am very glad to be here today to have this conversation as we look at our country and what's going on in our country in terms of social justice and the ongoing civil rights movement. So as you see, we've got a chat box here on the right. If you submitted questions previously, those have been passed on to Judge Cordell. And if you have other questions or comments throughout the discussion today, please enter them in the chat box. And again, say hi to everybody here so we know who all is here on the call. So we have a lot to talk about, and so we're going to get right at it. First, I just want to really welcome and thank Robert Luckett, Associate Professor of History at Jackson State University, and Judge LaDoris Cordell for providing us all this opportunity. And LaDoris, I will let you go ahead and take it away.
Thank you, Kristina. Welcome, everyone. Our history is our future. And how better to talk about our history and our future than with Professor Robert Luckett. I'm going to call you Robbie, if that's okay.
Please do. Yes, please do.
And what better time to do so than now? We are possibly, maybe at a tipping point in this country in the struggle for racial equality. So Robbie, I was in awe when I sat at Jackson State University in April 2019 and listened to you hold forth about the civil rights movement, 60s, the 70s and before. So I'm just thrilled that our Kristina had this wonderful idea to bring us this program. So thanks to both of you.
Well, thank you. Yeah.
All right, so let's get right to it. So Robbie, first, how are you handling everything? By everything, I mean the COVID-19, police killings, Black Lives Matter protests, Donald Trump, all of it. How are you handling? Where's your head?
I suppose about as well as possible, staying, in terms of my health, safe and sane, relatively. I hope most of everyone on this call is. Of course, the pandemic threw our last semester into a tailspin, and so grateful to get to meet so many wonderful people through COFO, the Council of Federated Organizations. For those who don't know, the center that I run at Jackson State, there was a civil rights headquarters back in 1964 during Freedom Summer, but we have no visitors now, and we won't at least until January 2021. And so that is I love meeting people, and I love talking about the movement and talking about Mississippi in the context of the movement. And so that's been a big change. It was hard on our students. Of course, none of us really know exactly what the fall semester is going to look like when it rolls around, and exactly what will happen with our classes. We're still kind of in limbo. And then in the context of George Floyd, for us, it was the 50th commemoration of the police shootings that happened at Jackson State in May. A couple of weeks later, George Floyd, all of it we're in a really particular moment of time that I think holds a lot of historic significance, and is one that I think most of us recognize. This is a special moment.
Yeah, I'm just, before I jump into why you as an historian see this as a special moment, Robbie, can you talk to us, just give us a minute or two about who you are, your background, and why you came to be such an expert in this field?
Well, I'm a Mississippian. I was born and raised here. I had a little bit of a different background than most white heterosexual men of my demographic raised in Mississippi. I had parents who had been activists, a mother in particular who became active in the movement in the mid-'60s in Jackson. And from there, I was raised with a bit of a different perspective and consciousness that most people I knew who looked like me didn't necessarily have. And from there, just pursued my interest through college, did an undergraduate degree at Yale, wrote a senior thesis on Emmett Till and the impact of Emmett Till, and on the civil rights movement in particular, and then graduate school at the University of Georgia, where I did a PhD in civil rights history. I left the University of Georgia in May of 2009 and came directly to Jackson State, and I've been there ever since as director of the Margaret Walker Center, the COFO Center, and associate professor of history. And, as a civil rights historian, to be in Mississippi is to be in Mecca. And you really understand how much of a living history it is. I joke with people all the time. I drive around my it's very much a living history here, and so it's always been something I've invested my research and my scholarship and my personal interests and passions in. Right. But to get to be here has been a special thing, and to be here during this moment is particularly special.
Right. So you've come full circle, Mississippi. Now you're right back.
That's right.
So let's talk about what is happening in this country right now. So my question to you, Robbie, as a historian, have we been here before? I have a feeling that things are different, and maybe it's because of the optics. More of my white brothers and sisters are in the mix. So what is your take? Is this different, or is history repeating itself, or a mix of it?
Well, the systemic use of violence against minority, marginalized Black and brown communities is nothing new. That has been a part of American history from day one. We only have to go back to the founding of the nation and really the enshrinement of slavery at the root of the nation, and our most famous founding fathers all having been slaveholders essentially, and the violent institution that was slavery, to understand that has been a part of American history from the beginning. And so this use of violence to enforce white supremacy and power in this nation is nothing new. What we are seeing is a moment in time where there is, I believe, a coalescence of events that's rooted, one, in the pandemic and the fact that people are hurting. We're in a crisis. They are already emotionally charged and tuned into the injustice that's in this nation, and then the impact of the images of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, right, Ahmaud Arbery, this perfect confluence of events that has exploded into all the protests and the international protests that we've seen in the last few weeks. I really think it's this moment in time where there's a confluence. I think what's different, and I was reading an article about this today, is that even compared to a year or two ago, the vast majority of Americans now say they support the Black Lives Matter movement. And that wasn't true.
Why is that, Robbie? I mean, why? Because it's quite clear on television in the 60s, the 70s, we saw police brutality in the South, and the dogs and the fire hoses. So is it the difference that it's cell phones, that now people are, picking all this up and using, the internet? What's different?
Yeah, I think a lot of it does have to do with the fact that people are at home and they're paying attention and they're tuned in and they have been moved by what they have seen. You've had these images before, and in fact, I would argue that's another part of the continuity of the civil rights movement to today, especially if we think about the significance of images for driving the movement. Emmett Till, the image of Emmett Till's body is essentially going to galvanize a generation of activists into being. It was his generation. He would have been 19 in 1960, the same age as the sit-in leaders and the Freedom Riders, right? And to a person, they point to seeing the image of Emmett Till's body in Jet magazine as the first galvanization of their consciousness. And so you think police dogs and water hoses, fire hoses in Birmingham. You think the image of Dr. King on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel, right? The moments that are seared into us are really due to media. What's different today is that media is ubiquitous and everybody has a cell phone and we're capturing a lot more images. But in this specific context of the coronavirus pandemic, you have people who are, this is what their attention is focused on, right? They're not, people are at home and they are also white and black and all Americans are feeling the burden of a crisis that I think has really struck a nerve with particularly the latest issues surrounding police violence. But you're absolutely right. That's nothing new in American history, and we've seen throughout time.
So what struck me is two things that you've said. One is that I hadn't seen the positive side of the COVID-19 pandemic, and you're saying, well, of course it's horrible, but it has kept us at home so that we can be more focused on things that are happening. And the other is, I guess what I'm hearing from you is that Emmett Till, and then you have the murder of George Floyd on camera. And it's like these pivotal moments. And it's sort of like, George Floyd is the Emmett Till of 2020. And I think you're right. I think people just cannot go into denial having witnessed that murder as it was happening. So, Robbie, let me ask you now about Mississippi. Your home, it's a state of 3 million people, of whom about 60% are white, 40% are black. When I think of Mississippi, some of what comes to mind are Emmett Till, Medgar Evers, the Freedom Rides, KKK, the Woolworth sit-ins, Fannie Lou Hamer. So talk to us about the great state of Mississippi and what has been happening there since the May 25th murder of George Floyd.
Well, it has really been a remarkable time in Mississippi, especially in terms of social justice. And we had young people organize the largest civil rights protest in downtown Jackson in the state of Mississippi since 1966, and what was the Meredith March Against Fear, on which Stokely Carmichael and Willie Ricks will popularize the term Black Power. That march was the largest that's ever been in the state of Mississippi. But we had thousands of people, white and black, showing up in downtown Jackson to stand hand in hand, arm in arm, in support of the Black Lives Matter movement and in support of the pursuit of justice. And it was organized by young people, which is also one of these interesting points of continuity. Young people have always been essential to social activism, and there's a number of reasons for that. But this group of young people organized this amazing event, and as the crowd marched through the streets of Jackson, it was a sea of humanity as far as you could see in every direction. Interestingly, we had everybody gathered in front of the governor's mansion, and there is a wall built around the governor's mansion today. And it really struck me that wall was built in 1970 after the protests that happened after the police shootings on our campus, when the city police and highway patrol showed up and fired nearly 500 rounds of ammunition in about 28 seconds into a women's dormitory. The protest that went downtown led to the erection of this barrier, this major wall around the governor's mansion, and that's where everybody gathered this year. Those protests led to a number of demands. There were explicit goals and demands from those protests, one of which has gotten a lot of press recently, and that was the removal of the Confederate battle emblem from our state flag in Mississippi. And we had one of the most remarkable and even just exciting weekends that I can ever remember. I don't know that I have ever cheered the Mississippi legislature before, but it happened this weekend as we got to watch them vote overwhelmingly to take down the state flag. And today at 3 o'clock your time, our governor is having a press conference to sign that bill into law that will finally take down that state flag. And it was emotional. Now, look, we all know the flag is the tip of the iceberg when it comes to social justice and racial equity, especially in a place like Mississippi. But symbols matter. And this has been a moment to celebrate. And there are so many people who have worked so hard for so long to bring that flag down. And so many people like Medgar Evers who didn't get to live to see it happen. And so it's been a joyous moment. Everybody knows that we still got work to do, but I look forward to seeing the governor's press conference today and showing up when they finally retire the flag in the coming days. Well, it'll officially be taken down from the state capitol. So what a remarkable
Robbie, were there any no votes in the legislature to take down the flag?
Yes, there were no votes, not surprisingly, but we're at the very end of our legislative session. And interestingly, because of where we were in the legislative session, technically the only way to push a bill forward at this point requires a supermajority in both houses. So you had to have 2/3 of both houses to vote in support of the measure for it to pass. And they got that in Mississippi, which meant, of course, you had every African-American member of the Senate and the state house, and all Democrats and all the independents voted yes, but a very significant part, the vast majority of Republicans in Mississippi even voted to support it. There were some nays, but still you had a 2/3 supermajorities in both houses that voted in favor of it. And there was a lot of pressure that was put on them, right? There were religious leaders showing up. There were faculty members, professors like me writing letters and saying, this is historically problematic. We need to make this change. And there were business leaders who in particular were making major statements about the fact that they wouldn't do business in Mississippi anymore if we didn't do something about the flag. And so it passed. And while there were some no votes, it overwhelmingly passed. And it was one of those moments that we don't get, those of us who do the work that I do in Mississippi, we don't get those moments too often in Mississippi where you really feel like there was a victory. But some good news in that regard for sure.
Yeah, I think it was huge. I mean, it was absolutely huge because the whole country, maybe the world, was watching. I know that someone in the media reached out to Merle Evers, who was the wife of Medgar, and she said something about her being just moved to tears. She just, to wrap her head around something that had happened. So Robbie, you said, it's a flag. It stood for a lot of things, but it was a flag. So it comes down. I know a commission will be constituted to come up with a design for the new one, but what does that portend though for Mississippi? A flag comes down. I mean, I'm sure some people will say, well, our work is done. We got rid of it. What do you see just for Mississippi? Because I'm going to ask you a broader question in a little bit about the country. So what does the flag coming down in Mississippi portend for Mississippi?
Well, there are a lot of groups who are organizing around various issues that see this as a moment of opportunity, a moment to really push social justice agenda items. Some of the things that I've seen, even conservatives in Mississippi talking about that never would have touched these issues in the past, have been things like social justice reform. There is a conservative legislator who has introduced another bill that would release nonviolent offenders from who have been sentenced to life, who have life sentences for nonviolent crimes, that would essentially give them an opportunity to be released at this point. So we're talking about repeat drug offenders, the 3 strikes and you're out, and the idea that these people could have lives, right, of value and dignity, and don't need to be locked away forever. And that was just in the news today. We certainly see continued pushes. For me, one of my main interests, many of you know, is the history of public education in Mississippi, and I serve on the Board of Trustees of Jackson Public Schools here, and we have 20,000 students. Really pushes to attempt to equitably support public education in the state of Mississippi, which has been a long fight here. There's a lot of impetus around that. Other social justice reforms, police reform is on the table in Mississippi, thinking about how we police our communities, thinking about how we fund police forces in the state of Mississippi, how we train police officers, the catchphrase of community policing, what all that means and what that entails. Also, I had a school district leader in the Mississippi Delta contact me yesterday, wanting to know if I could help them figure out how to implement civil rights and African American history in their social studies curriculum throughout their school district. In the Mississippi Delta, these are things that are bubbling to the surface right now that there's momentum behind. We got a lot of work, and not all of it is going to happen right now, and we still see things that are on the table that are taking place that require all of us to pay attention and to still be engaged in. But there are a number of issues that are on the table here that have not been on the table ever before.
Right. One of the things that I noticed in this flag issue in Mississippi is that there was a great impetus really because of economics. There were organizations, sports organizations saying, we're not going to do business in Mississippi. So, I mean, it may not have even been like a change of heart and change of mind about the flag that moved the legislators, but I think they really got the message that corporate America and sports, other big industries were saying to Mississippi, if you don't bring that down, you're going to lose a whole bunch of money. Well, so, you know, in my view, it's kind of like any means necessary. Fine. If it's not that you have a change of heart and mind, but the economics that moves you, so I'm concerned that the flag is now down. What do you think?
Yeah, you know, I think a lot of credit. Some of you may have heard this news story. There was a football player at Mississippi State University who said he was going to transfer if the flag didn't change, and that made national news. And as much as people love college football in the Deep South, that impacted people. They're starting, and it did make them question this. Well, if he feels that way, why are we doing this? And I would say too, the Speaker of the House of Representatives in Mississippi, Philip Gunn, is an extremely conservative man. And at the time of the church shootings in South Carolina, he came out at that time and said that his Christian beliefs led him to acknowledge that the flag in the state of Mississippi needed to change. And he said that after the South Carolina shootings, and he has stood by that. And I actually take him at his word at that. I think he really did reflect in a state that is extremely religious. I think he reflected on his values, and I think he did have a change of heart. I'm willing to give him credit for that, and I'm not willing to give him credit for very much, to be honest. But I do think that there were people who changed their minds and they looked at it. And the ministers who showed up, the Southern Baptist Convention issued a statement that the Mississippi flag should change. And when you consider as how many white and black Mississippians are Southern Baptists, that had an impact on some of the legislators. So I think it's a little bit of both. And there were also some who just didn't want to be known as that person who voted against it. And history will remember those people who did vote against it, I believe.
It sure will. You know, we just got a question in from one of our participants here, and it's a good question. I'd like to get your sense about it. And the question is, do you think that since the vote on the flag in Mississippi, there may be a stronger push to remove Confederate statutes just across the state as well?
There are, and some of you may have also heard, of course, the University of Mississippi is one of the most notorious places for the display of Confederate iconography. And there is a Confederate statue that sits at the prow of the campus. And it is in fact now being moved from the front of the campus and will be relocated to an old Confederate cemetery in Oxford, Mississippi. The fact that that's happening at the University of Mississippi, a place known as Ole Miss, which most people don't realize the etymology of the term Ole Miss is not Old Mississippi. It's a slave term. The slave's mistress, the slave's wife, the master's wife was Ole Miss, the master's daughter was Little Miss. And in the early 20th century, as all these Confederate monuments are developing, it becomes the term of reverence for the University of Mississippi, Ole Miss. And so even that is a slave term, and people are they're becoming more aware, they're becoming more engaged, and we are certainly seeing it. Interestingly, during the flag debate, this point was brought up, and it's one of the ones that's just kind of, it's a trope that's repeated, that, well, where is this going to stop? Are we going to tear down every monument and every statue? Are we going to change the name of the city of Jackson because it's named after Andrew Jackson? And there's this kind of slippery slope logic to it, that somehow this is going to, and the state senator, Briggs Hobson, who was leading the discussion, said, and he's from Vicksburg, where we have the Vicksburg Military National Park, and he essentially said, I'm happy to talk to anybody who wants to move their Confederate statues to the Vicksburg Military National Cemetery and put them in the cemetery. So yeah, these are conversations that are happening and are very seriously happening all over the state. The city of Jackson did actually remove a statue of Andrew Jackson just this past week from downtown. So these things are happening, and it's encouraging. And for it to happen in Mississippi, you know, I said Mississippi is a microcosm of America. We are a part of America, as much a part of America as we are apart from America. And if it's happening here, I think there's hope for other places. Wow. We're not going to get there overnight, and there's still a lot more work to do.
Right. So we're going to talk about that, Robbie. And so I'm just trying to get it straight. So Ole Miss was the master's wife.
That's right. Yes.
Good Lord. Okay. All right. So your New York Times opinion piece, wonderful piece, remarkable. I learned so much about the 1970 shoot 'em up at Jackson State University that you alluded to just a few minutes ago. So in your piece, I'm going to just take a little bit of what you wrote here. You write, and it was kind of the end of the op-ed, white Americans in particular must take responsibility and action if our society is to begin rooting out racist power and all its implications. So what is it that white Americans ought to be doing? And in that, your answer, I want to know why now and not 30 years ago, when the oppression of African Americans by law enforcement was so blatant. So what is it, why now do you believe that white America is waking up, and what is it that white Americans today ought to be doing?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I appreciate it. And the truth is, white Americans have always had this burden, and it is something that they have needed to address from the beginning of time. I mean, it doesn't really take much historical research to look at the hypocrisy of someone as beloved as Thomas Jefferson to understand that when he died, he did not free any of his slaves, including Sally Hemings, the woman whom he had many children with, right? Who was many years younger than he was. There's always been a burden on white America to fix this, because white Americans have benefited from white supremacy, and even in ways that have been subconsciously, right? White supremacy is embedded in American history. It's embedded in America today. And so for those people who benefit the most from white supremacy, we have to demand that it changes, because we've got the most power to demand that it changes. And I think that we're at a moment now where people are beginning, white people in particular, right now are asking, well, how can I do that? Like you said, how can I be, one thing that you hear a lot is, how can we be allies? And I think that for a lot of people, that's an important first step. Just how can you plug in? How can you just stand in support? We had the march a couple of weeks ago in downtown Jackson, and I had good white liberal friends who asked me, can we go to the march? And I'm going, yes, of course you can go to the march. You can be there. You can stand with your Black brothers and sisters and demand this reform and demand this justice. But I do believe, and the point I was really trying to make in that article, and when I talk about it, that we have to eventually move beyond just being allies. We have to move beyond alliances. We have to be active proponents of change in America and of these reforms. And I think it's something that comes to everybody in different, at different times. And there has to be some level of of learning how to engage in some level of comfort as you proceed along the scale, along the road of your activism to being really active proponents of change in America. And I think it's really up to everyone to look and say, what do I care the most about? What are the changes that I want to see the most in America? And you know, I often tell people, none of us are going to change everything overnight. We're just not going to do it. But all of us can do something, and all of us can do something more than what we're already doing. And so whether your passion is public education, like me, whether it's social justice reform, criminal justice reform, whether it's access to healthcare, universal healthcare, really pushing and demanding that the people we elect to lead us begin implementing the changes that we want to see in America. That I think that's essential, and I think it is essential for white Americans to do it because we have benefited the most. We are the ones who benefit from white supremacy, not just the most. We are the ones who benefit from white supremacy, and we must be ready and able to stand up and to demand the change that we want to see in America. And it's really, in the end, not just enough for us to stand beside folks and say we support them. We actually have to demand it ourselves.
Well, that's interesting, and I guess I want to try to be a little more specific. So, for example, I mean, I know I am a little tired of my white brothers and sisters coming to me and saying, "What can I do? What should I do?" And you know, my view, the problem is not with African Americans. It's not Black people. We're not the problem.
No.
So we have institutions that have, in so many ways, made it clear that their space is not for us, the people that look like me, but it is okay for white Americans. So it's about, in my view, it's about seeing that changes. Those spaces are where we have an expectation of being there and not seen as, you know, being challenged because we fell asleep in the college lounge where I am a student, but a white student calls someone because a Black woman is asleep, because she's not viewed
Right.
as that being her space. You know, we also have the terms now, you know, Karen and Ken, where they are, you know, white folks who are just calling 911 like it's a customer service line, which it isn't, on people of color who they believe are just shouldn't be in that space. So, I mean, I still, you know, I think that folks need to hear more about, you know, what specifically they should be doing and taking the initiative. And so I don't know if you have any ideas, but let me throw out one thing. So I'm a little tired too of hearing the phrase white privilege, right? So I've had white folks come to me and, oh, I'm so guilty. I feel so guilty. I've had all this white privilege all my life. And I don't like the term, because the term makes it sound like that everything that they have access to is somehow a special privilege, when what they're really saying is that America and democracy is operating as it should for me because I'm white, but it's not operating as it should for you because you're Black. So it's not a privilege. It is just an expectation of what democracy is, and it's not been open to us. So I don't like the terminology, and I haven't yet come up with another phrase for it. So I'd like to hear, you know, your comments on that, and also anything specifically like policing. What can your, you know, now your woke white brother or sister do with regard to policing if they believe that there is systemic racism in policing?
Yeah. So one, as far as the issue of white privilege, I couldn't agree with you more. I really was informed about this in thinking more deeply about it by a book that a friend of mine from Mississippi wrote, Kiese Lehman, called Heavy, which is a memoir of his growing up, which I believe you know, and it's, wow, it is just a powerful examination of race in America, and particularly a deep dive into his life. But one of the things he says about white privilege is that to call it privilege is just way too innocuous. Because that's not what it is. It's really white. It's a reflection of white supremacy, and it's a reflection of a white power structure and how it works. And so it is really a misnomer to, like, as you said, to call it privilege. And so it functions in a way that does nothing but to reinforce white supremacy. And we have to be aware of that, you know, and we have to begin examining our personal biases, right? And looking at the things that that we do, often unintentionally, subconsciously, that reflects white supremacy. The knee-jerk reaction to call the police on a person of color, right, who's walking through your neighborhood, who seems suspicious. I even think about the man who was killed in Atlanta, who was passed out, inebriated at a Wendy's drive-through, right? Is there anything in the world that should have led to the escalation of that situation to the point where he was murdered? Those are things that that's going to take a lot of soul searching and a lot of people asking tough questions and becoming comfortable being uncomfortable. And we have to challenge each other to really think hard about those things and to be willing to engage that. And I do think that dialogue is essential. As far as the specific steps that people can do, you know, one of the things that we're doing in Jackson right now with the school board, we have, like many school districts, have our own police force in Jackson Public Schools. Well, what does our police force look like in our school districts, right? Are they coming in armed, right? Are they coming in police uniforms? What does their presence look like? What are we spending in our budget on bullets in Jackson Public Schools? Just the meat and potatoes of what does it actually mean to police our schools in Jackson, and what do we want them to do? What do we want their roles to be? Do we need metal detectors in all of our high schools? When you walk through the building, this immediate assumption that that there's something to not trust in our children in Jackson. It's not saying that we remove all barriers of protection, and we also understand that we still live in a very dangerous world, but just rethinking specifically how we police ourselves in our schools with our children. And I think thinking about things like that in all of our communities across this country, thinking about the details of you speak about the impact of corporations and money on the state flag issue in Mississippi. Where do we spend our dollars? What are we spending that money on? How are we asking our police forces to act in ways that really should be more informed for social work than policing, right? And so I think there are little ways in a lot of different areas that people can plug in and be concerned and ask some hard questions, and not just continue assuming that everything is okay because as a white person in America, it doesn't impact us. Right? You could just be oblivious to it all if you let yourself.
Right. So one thing I want to follow up on, and really good point, but the key, I think, for all of us, I don't care what race, what ethnicity, is getting information and having knowledge. I mean, how does your city work? How does your town work? What is the budget? And who is it that votes on the budget? Usually it's either a city council or a board of supervisors. So we need, all of us need to know what they're doing. Why are they voting? What are each of those items in the budget? It means taking the time to learn this stuff. It also means that if you want to have a say in it, to actually run for local office. Mm-hmm. And I'm not just putting it out there, because here in Palo Alto, a city of about 70,000 people, but it's the heart of Silicon Valley, I decided to run for a seat on the city council. And I did, and I got elected, and I served for 4 years, and I learned all about how cities work, the infrastructure and land use and all of that helped inform me somewhat about, the kinds of things that I could do. But to pick up on something else, Rob, you said about how we just kind of don't even see things. So for example, and I don't know if it's true in all Walmarts around the country, but at least out here, the Walmarts had hair care products out for sale, but Black hair care items were put in a locked cabinet.
Absolutely.
They were locked up. So if you're African American and you wanted to buy a product, you had to go to an employee who would come with a key and open it up, because the implication is that Black folks were going to go steal hair products. Not white people. They don't steal hair products, but only Black folks. So that is so racist. And that as a result of, again, really stemming from, George Floyd's murder, you have now people speaking out about that, and Walmart's saying, oh, you know what? We're going to unlock the cabinets now. I mean, that's just blatant racism. Right. And we've all had to kind of live with it, and everybody goes on. The others, like Aunt Jemima, Uncle Ben. I remember growing up, I hated going down the supermarket aisle and seeing that box. And by the way, when I grew up, she had a bandana, right, and, real big smile on her face. And she got modernized. They took off the bandana and, gave her a little hairdo. Uncle Ben's. I mean, all of that is happening now, but it's stuff that, we knew wasn't right, but we also knew nothing was going to happen anyway. But that's changed now. So it's about becoming aware. And then once you're aware, what are you going to do about it? You're going to speak up, right? So let's talk about voting. So voter suppression today, in my view, is as blatant as it was back in the days of the civil rights era. And so instead of poll taxes, literacy tests, today we have requirements for photo IDs. We have fewer polling places. We've got the huge opposition coming out of the White House to voting by mail. So Robbie, do you have a notion of what all of us can do to ensure that in November, that election will not be undermined?
I think we all better be paying attention, because I think that what we're seeing right now is laying the foundation to undermine that election. And I also serve on the board of Common Cause Mississippi, and many of you know the national organization Common Cause. And Mississippi has some of the most restrictive voter laws in the nation. And there is extreme opposition to not just mail-in voting, to expanding. We don't have, you have to have calls for absentee voting in Mississippi. And so there continues to be a lot of opposition to expanding that. And so I do think that we all need to be paying attention. I think recently the news out of Kentucky with the primary that just happened there and the drastic reduction of polling places, I think we're going to see a lot of attempts to do things like that in the November election, where we reduce access to the right to vote. And I think that should be something that could scare us. And it strikes me that that our current president sees his election possibilities dimming unless he does something to undermine the election, and we better be aware. And so in our communities, when we see things like attempts to reduce polling places, the opposition to mail-in voting, an expanded voting window, right, during the coronavirus, where you might have a week to 10 days to be able to go and vote. Those are things that we can begin asking questions about and paying attention to. And in any and all attempts to reduce access to the right to vote should really, really be something that we're paying attention to and are aware of in all forms. And I think that is a really crucial issue leading up to November in the next 4 months.
Right. And, and of course, it's critical that everyone votes. And that's a concern, because communities of color in certain parts of this country don't vote, haven't voted, and that absolutely has to change. So I didn't, by the way, to those who are participating here, I didn't mean to ignore concerns from the Latinx communities, from our indigenous peoples communities, because there are things like Taco Bell used to have this little Chihuahua, the dog that would run around and mimic, supposedly, Mexicans. And then there is Chiquita Banana, the whole thing. And then we have the Washington Redskins. And these are all things that they're not just names. I mean, they really symbolize white supremacy and the racism in this country. And once we start seeing how pervasive it is, I think you have to be motivated to do something. I mean, I look at racism, as a virus, just as a virus, and it's permeated for everything for 401 years. And we need to get the vaccine, and the vaccine is right here. It's us. We're the vaccine. We're the cure.
It's
So it's
really education.
about getting the knowledge. Go ahead.
No, racism is an invention. It's learned. It's created. It's not something that people are born with, and the answer to it is education. And I think also just the proximity that we have to each other now is some reason to be hopeful that we can do something about racism, because that proximity breeds knowledge and breeds understanding and empathy and compassion. And perhaps there is something there about it. But yeah, you're absolutely right. And there's so many different ways that that all of this is informed in America in every aspect of American society.
Yeah. So I'm also getting some questions from those of you who are participating. So I'm going to pull up one of them. One question says, aside from the flag, getting the flag down in Mississippi, what about economic justice? What about letting the wrongfully accused out of prison? What else should the Mississippi legislature be acting on? And I guess this question really could apply, nationwide. So
Yeah.
economic injustice. Right now we have inequality. There's no question. What do you think people could be doing on that issue?
Yeah, and there is some really amazing work being done around that in Mississippi right now. There is a fabulous organization being run by a friend of mine who's beginning to provide free, no strings attached economic stimulus to single Black mothers. Essentially a check every month to support them. And the work around that has been really remarkable, and the attention that's been focused on those efforts here to provide some kind of economic sustenance for people who otherwise don't have access to any kind of financial support. And so just that little bit of income, really free of any and all red tape, is kind of a revolutionary idea. That's just one thing that we're seeing in Mississippi. Economic justice also in the form of equitable access to healthcare, equitable access. How about access to Wi-Fi? In the age of the coronavirus, there was this assumption in our nation that we could move all education to an online form and not somehow leave behind all of the poor people in America. And there is definitely a digital divide that still exists. And that's one of those too, that particularly white people of a certain economic range just seem to assume that, everybody's got the internet. And that's simply not the case. We had to print in Jackson Public Schools close to 6 million pages of instructional packages for our students who didn't have access to the internet for about the last 6 weeks of the school year. And so economic justice is, I think, key to it all. And even in terms of voting, right? The reason that minority communities don't turn out to vote is that they're predominantly poor, and it's hard for poor people in America to vote. You're seeing some corporations now coming out and saying that they're going to make election day a day off, right? There's going to be a holiday in their companies, demanding that in America that election day be a national holiday or be on Saturdays, right? Or be particularly over an extended period of time. If you're poor in Mississippi, you may be working multiple jobs. If you're poor anywhere in America, you may be working multiple jobs. You may or may not have access to transportation. If you live in places like Mississippi, we basically don't have public transportation. And so the right to vote is very much an economic justice issue, and one that
right.
is essential.
Right. I've always been, it's just curious about the fact that voting is not regulated by the federal government. So every state can have its own rules on voting. And apparently the founding fathers didn't contemplate that would be a problem. But I do believe that what we do need is we need some federal laws that govern voting so that individual states can't do what they're doing now. Robbie, what do you think about reparations for African Americans? Do you have an opinion on that?
Yeah, I believe in them. I support them. I think there are ways that we can figure out how to make it work.
Can you give us some idea, a little idea?
Yeah, I mean, I think, one of the things that we're seeing here in Mississippi is the program I just talked about, where we actually provide guaranteed income to poor people, and say, you're going to be able to pay your rent this month, right? And we actually provide access to financial resources, and we have that capacity in this country to make it happen. Support for educational institutions and HBCUs, and student loan reform, right? There are many avenues through which reparations and money can flow back into the hands of people who have been stripped of any and all economic power in this country for the better part of the last 300 years. And so it is obviously a complicated issue that is going to be difficult, but I think we're seeing some movement, and we're seeing it in some areas where there are, of course, more progressives, more liberal people thinking and talking about these issues, and you're starting to see some of this happen. And I think as the conversation around reparations becomes normalized, it's going to become a larger and larger part of what we are thinking about and doing in terms of social justice in America. So I think there are many different forms that it can take, but I certainly believe in it. And I think most people on this call understand that poverty is cyclical. It is a trap that is nearly impossible for so many people to ever emerge from. I think about our children in Jackson, and I think about the fact that 10 to 15% of our student body population is homeless. That our children are homeless in Jackson, and through no fault of their own. And how are they going to escape that if we don't provide resources, if we don't provide some form of reparations or whatever you want to call it to support them and to give them some opportunity? It's just they're going to be stuck in it, and their children and their children's children are going to be stuck in it.
Yeah, and it's so interesting because the first step in reparations to even get there is the government has to apologize. First, you apologize for slavery, and then you begin to make amends as a government. This country has never, and when I say country, I mean the government, has never apologized. So we've apologized for the internment, the awful internment of Japanese Americans, and we've given some monetary reparations. There has been no apology. So no, I'm sorry. And that's going to be huge. I mean, to wrap your head around that, it's just two words. I'm sorry. Government is sorry. And that has been, it's just this huge hurdle that has to be dealt with. We have about, 6 minutes left. And I want to just touch on policing to get your thinking about this. So let me just throw out where I am at on policing very quickly. I think reforms are fine. No more chokeholds, de-escalate violence. That's fine because it's the immediate fix. It helps keep people from being killed by the police. But where I'm coming from now is that I believe that we must completely dismantle and rethink and reimagine policing in America. Policing which really got its start from hunting down escaped slaves, the whole policing of poor communities of color. So where I'm coming from is that I think there are 18,000 police departments in the United States, and each has their own turf, their own jurisdiction, and each has their own culture. And I believe those cultures, to the most extent, are infused with racism. And so what I would like to see is, I'll just take a police department like San Jose Police Department, which has made the New York Times this week because there are officers who have a secret Facebook group that have been exchanging the most racist, horrendous kinds of messages about the Black Lives Matter movement. So it's now been exposed. So my view, you fire everybody. Chief, everybody's fired. And then you have a new approach to policing. And then if they want to be hired, they have to reapply and they have to adopt the new approach. You've mentioned it, Robbie, community policing. And that's not rocket science. It just means police are out of their cars all day. They're walking, they're getting to know everybody in every house, every neighborhood. This was done in Camden, New Jersey in 2013.
I was gonna say that.
And before 2013, the solve rate for murders was only 16%. 2 years after they fired everybody, hired some back, some not back, the solve rate for murders went to 61% because communities began trusting the police because they were there with a different attitude, not to be occupiers, not to oppress, but to indeed be protectors and to help keep people safe. I'm not saying things are perfect in Camden, but it was a major change. In a minute or two, what's your view on policing?
Yeah, I think that is probably the answer, although I don't know that we will see in our lifetimes the complete, the disbandment of all police forces. Really retraining and helping them rethink and demilitarizing our police is one of those other kind of common sense places that we could bring some change in this country. And again, that is also tied to funding. What are we giving police departments money for, and what are they investing in? Armored personnel carriers and tanks simply should not be something that local police forces, I believe, have access to. And those are things that we can demand and demand now. And I do think that is change that's on the table that I think we're going to see. And there's even outside of places like Camden, New Jersey. My good friend Susan Glisson, who's an incredible scholar and was the founding director of the William Winter Institute for Racial Reconciliation here in Mississippi, she runs an organization now called Sustainable Equity. And they have a contract with the Birmingham Police Department, Birmingham, Alabama, where they're going in and retraining all police officers in Birmingham in how to engage community policing. They call it the welcome table approach, how we welcome everybody of different backgrounds, different skin colors, different races, ethnicities, religions, and we bring them together and we engage in dialogue and we listen to each other, we learn from each other, and we get to know each other. And the fact that she's doing that work right now in Birmingham, I think is hopeful for the rest of the country that we can see this change, and that it is part of the dialogue. It is part of what we're seeing nationally.
So you said the word hopeful. Are you hopeful, Robbie, in light of what's happening in this country?
Yeah, I live in Mississippi. 50 years ago in Mississippi, the work that I do, I would be risking my life on a daily basis. And that's simply not the case, right? And, it wasn't that long ago. You mentioned Murley Evers. Medgar was assassinated in his driveway. It took over 30 years for his murderer to be convicted, right? And Murley is still alive and living in California, right? And not just her reaction to the flag. Some of you may have seen her on the national news leading a Black Lives Matter protest in her retirement village in California, right? And Murley's and Medgar's daughter, Rena, who runs the Medgar Murley Evers Institute here in Jackson, is a good friend of mine. And, she's here today, right? This is not that long ago, historically speaking. And the fact that we've seen the changes we have seen is reason to be hopeful. Mississippi has changed a lot in 55 years. That is not to say that we still have a lot to change. And we still have a long ways to go, but there are hopeful signs. I saw someone asked about Medicaid expansion. That's also on the table now. We're actually discussing finally accepting Medicaid expansion in our state legislature right now. That is part of the current debate in the halls of the Mississippi legislature.
Wow. So one of the takeaways, got it. Thank you, Robert. One of the takeaways I get is if it can happen in Mississippi, it can happen anywhere. And I believe that. So we're going to wrap things up. We've been going for an hour. One of the takeaways, I think important one, is that, don't get overwhelmed by everything that's happening here. If you want to make a difference, you pick one thing that you want to dedicate your time and your energy to, be it voting, be it speaking up, going to protests, local police. Just pick your niche and get as much information and approach it. If everyone does that, if there is good reason and to be hopeful. So as we close, Kristina, I thank you. Robbie, I thank you. I thank everybody who has participated in this. And one thing I know for sure, and that is that we need you, Professor Luckett, now more than ever. So please keep writing, keep researching, keep teaching, keep spreading the word about the Margaret Walker Center that you direct. Keep speaking out for the America until America fulfills its promise of justice and equality for all. So thank all of you. Be inspired by this man, and let us go forward.
And by you, thank you for your career and your lifetime of service. You know, we're here doing this work in many ways. We are grateful to have you as part of our world and community as well.
Thank you, Robbie.
Thank you, Robbie. Thank you, Professor Luckett and Judge Cordell. Really appreciate you making the opportunity for all of us here to connect and have this conversation. Thank you to all of you listening, and we'll be in touch from the Commonwealth Club. Have a great afternoon. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.